you can have a female depicted and appearing feminine who is undertaking a hero's journey, and a male character who is undertaking a heroine's journey, and of course non-binary characters or third gender characters doing the same. So in other words, a hero's journey does not always have to be a dude.
Across the globe, storytellers are flipping the script. In books, in film, in TV, theatre and art. I'm Kimberly Lipschus, and this is The Storymakers Rebellion, a podcast about the rule breakers, trailblazers and visionaries who are shaping stories on their own terms.
Gail Carriger is my guest this week, and she's here to discuss her writing career and her non-fiction book, written for writers, The Heroine's Journey. As a multiple New York Times bestselling author, she has millions of books in print and a fan base in many languages. She writes comedies of manners and a steampunk mixed with urban and sci-fi fantasy, and is both traditionally and self-published. And Gail is very fond of tea, which wins a special place in my heart. Welcome, Gail. I'm really, really blessed to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super delighted, and what a flattering intro. I feel very important.
Well, why don't we start at the very beginning? What is your favorite tea at the moment?
Oh, oh God, you ask a really hard question out the gate. I'm a loyalist to like my regular morning tea, and then I shake it up with the tea that I drink throughout the rest of the day, I guess is what I would say. So my regular tea is Twinings 1706 Strong, aka the Gold Label. I've been drinking that tea for 20 years or more. I was raised on Twinings, and then they changed the regular English breakfast for the American market, and then I had to go on a hunt, and it's been a whole saga. But the saga was settled 20 years ago with 1706, and I have not deviated since. So that's my morning cuppa. And then I change what I have in the sort of after lunch afternoons. And I've been exploring some greens recently, partly at doctor's orders. But I like them iced, and I like doing strange things with them, putting stuff in my tea, like Taiwanese bubble tea style. So I get pretty
Yes.
experimental. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So where did you grow up, and what sparked your love of story? And in a way, I guess, because you've said in your book that writers are the custodians of story, when did you really feel the call? Because I think we can fall into that soul journey without realizing it. But when did you actively feel the call?
So I grew up in Northern California. Both my parents are transplants, though. They're both expats. My mom's from the UK. My dad's originally from Denmark, but it doesn't really count. He mostly grew up in the East Coast. And I guess, but my parents used to ship me back to the UK pretty regularly, to the grandparents, for various reasons. And it was my mother who would read to me. And I think that's where it all started. I think if you get read to as a kid, you probably gonna have a pretty intimate relationship with story in some form or another. I was also not allowed to have television. There was no television in my house, so I listened to a lot of books on tape growing up as well, and would draw or do something with my hands while I was. So I think story was very early, specifically like the spoken word style of storytelling. I used to get taken. One of my sort of adopted aunties is from South Africa, and she would tell the most amazing just story. Just the kid, like neighborhood kids, would just sit around her feet, and she would just tell these incredible folk stories. And so I've really like clear memories of that as well. So yeah, and then my mom would read to me out loud, and then if I didn't like the endings, I would get mad at her, and then I would tell her the ending that it should be, and I would retell the story. And that sort of, I was like, Ma, you really should have known from the get-go that I was going to be a storyteller.
It was always going to be in there. But you had
Yeah.
another life before
I
this, which
did.
was also storytelling in a weird way.
In a weird way, storytelling with data, I guess. Yeah, I was originally an archaeologist by training and profession. That's what I always thought I would be and what I would pursue. And I was I guess 2/3, 3/4 of the way through my PhD when my first book started to do really, really well, and then my second book hit the New York Times, and then sort of decisions had to be made, and I put that career on hold and have never picked it back up again. But that very much informed my storytelling in a different way, like you said, because my focus was originally in the classical world and originally on ceramics, and therefore you need to know a lot about mythology and the
Mm.
mythology of the time, period, and place, because that's the iconography on ceramic pieces in particular from the Greek period and the Roman period tends to be very much tied to the mythology. So it helps if you can just identify the figures that you're seeing on pottery. So yeah, so that I dovetailed and took a lot of gender in classical mythology and things like that. When you're doing an undergraduate degree in archaeology in the United States, it's part of the anthropology track, not the art history track. And it's an interdisciplinary major, so you have to sort of take classes in lots of different places. And I always loved the classics. Try and get in
Yeah.
as many classics as I
Interesting how
could.
the mythology just kind of wove it, so it found you or you found
Mm.
it. There was a
Yeah,
connection there.
absolutely.
Yeah. So could you, that's actually a good segue. Could you explain gender tropes? Because I think that's something that the heroine's journey that you wrote is so clear in, particularly the difference between sex and gender and how
Mm.
important it is to these two narrative arcs, and bearing in mind that a lot of these people are probably screenwriters that are going to be listening.
Of
So
course.
I think where your writing side of it really
Yes.
helps inform.
And a huge part of the sort of anthropology component, I would say as well. So, as an anthropologist in the States, the first thing that you learn, or one of the early things we learn, is that gender is a social construct. So the idea of masculine and feminine, and as iconographic and physical markers, so appearance and things like that, that's very much socially constructed by the gender in which you are born. And it has something to do with, but very little trackable pattern recognition in terms of biological sex, which is basically your skeletal structure and organ structures, etc. So the idea that the two were inextricably linked, would never even have occurred to me, quite frankly. So
Yeah.
it was interesting when I was writing this book that I was like, oh, I have to explain this to people. Um, so essentially, it's this idea that the story we tell, because that we are storytellers, has as an intimate part of its structure these sort of telegraphed messages about what it means to be masculine and feminine, but the biological characteristics of the character undertaking that journey don't necessarily have to track. So, to put it very, very simply, you can have a female depicted and appearing feminine character who is undertaking a hero's journey, and a male character who is undertaking a heroine's journey, and also, of course, non-binary characters or third gender characters doing the same. It's so, in other words, a hero's journey does not always have to be a dude or
And
nothing.
people misunderstand that all the time. They think that this is the hero's journey, or I'm writing a heroine, therefore it's a heroine's journey.
Exactly. And it's yeah, and then that partly has to do with, frankly, the limits on the English language. We don't we
Oh,
don't and also that Campbell, who essentially initially decided what a hero's journey was, called it the hero's journey. And he and most Jungian psychiatrists, to be fair, conflate a hero with being a man or male. So, yeah, but that's a whole other sort of different arena of academic study. But when you're moving it into the arena of narrative and storytelling from a fictional standpoint, it sort of behooves us to realize that the biological sex of your main character doesn't necessarily dovetail to the journey that that character is on any more than a 4-act structure story is only ever undertaken by, I don't know, caterpillars or something. Like, it doesn't make any sense.
yeah. Yeah, but and yet, well, the things that kind of hang off that hero is the terms weak and strong, and
Right,
from a
right.
cultural perspective, and it's very
Exactly.
dangerous when we expect
Yeah.
men to. one way.
Yeah, and I practice a bit in the book, but there's an idea that because we have essentially sort of glorified the hero's journey, and it tends to be the one people reach for and people kind of admire and talk about and study and do all of these things with the most, we sort of allowed what that story tells us is strengths and weakness and victory and success to permeate the culture that then admires that story, which is, incredibly dangerous. An example, for example, is that in the hero's journey in particular, like solitary action and self-reliance and being able to defeat sort of the enemy one-on-one and be victorious as a solo winner of a contest is regarded as very, very strong.
Mhm.
But I that doesn't, I mean, and that's sort of then become tied to how we define the very word strength. Whereas in the context of a heroine's journey, for example, learning who you can rely on, who you can ask for help from, who you can network with, and building a sort of team is the definition of strength. So they're kind of diametrically opposed in that regard. But because we tend to admire the one story more than the other critically, we've sort of conflated the very idea of strength with this.
And I guess that's where they cross-pollinate into culture, stories, film, books, cross-pollinate this kind of, the classic Star Wars. And this is strength, the solo journey. And then people who are absorbing that, particularly even young people, are like, oh, that's what I need to be like. So they do cross-pollinate. It's very important.
Yeah. Much I've been thinking about a lot recently, actually. I was watching a linguistic professor talk about what it means to define a word. The word, what does word mean, right? And I was in like, what word is a set of sounds that symbolizes something. And that is indeed also kind of what a story is in its way. It's a set of concepts that symbolizes something, and whether we like it or not, when we are purveying these narratives, we're sending out into the world a set of messages and themes, which are absorbed by the readers. And you only have to look at to what sort of stories people turn to in times of crisis. So, for example, during the pandemic, it's no accident that people started to watch Contagion and Plague, uh, television. They started to read those sorts of books. They started to watch those movies, etc. And that to me, as a pure escapist, was shocking. I was like, "Oh, no, I need to read, like, sci-fi romances." Like, I have to go completely somewhere else, right? But and yes, there were certainly a lot of us doing that as well. But it's definitely the case that what people start to read is and people were reaching for those narratives because they wanted to watch other people coping with it better than they were coping with it, or in a successful way by their definition of success, winning against the disease or escaping the sort of inevitable downfall of humanity, right? And that is because what deep at our core, those of us who consume fictional narratives are looking for is a kind of symbolic pathway that we might be able to follow ourselves, but in a digestible way that's not like a nonfiction thing instructing us or teaching us. And so what we are doing when we write these fictional narratives is putting out a kind of entertaining manual to our readers, whether we or they really realize it.
Interesting. And also, when you reminded me, because in the pandemic, it was more apparent than ever that people were, before the pandemic had happened, people were writing books about pandemics. And there was the game Pandemic was released. And so there's almost something that's kind of coming out of the collective unconscious as history occurs. Like similarly in World War II, I believe there was a whole lot of documents that were smuggled out of people studying dreams just before Hitler started to come to power, and there was a lot of boots on pavement and guns and Alsatians, and so it's amazing what comes out as well as what we need in those times. We do make sense of story through other lives'
Absolutely.
story.
I have a private theory, which frankly I haven't done the stats analysis on, so this is just me winging it, about the idea that what monster it is we're coping with at any one time, particularly in, say, the fantasy or the urban fantasy genre, kind of reflects the culture. So sometimes it's zombies, and I think that's when the culture writing those narratives is most in fear of, say, mob rule or like the communist threat or something like that. Then zombies have a big resurgence. And then, at other times it'll be dystopian. And then at still other times it'll be vampires. Vampires tend to represent the aristocracy and sort of a class war that's going on. But you'll also find fetishization. So like the rise of the vampires and like CEO billionaire romances where, there's this clearly as a culture, we're unpacking how we feel about class divides and very like gross examples of extreme wealth. And so, yeah, this is always fascinating to me. I feel like if you go back and study the dawn of, say, genre fiction, which is sort of during the post-romantic Victorian era, where you get this very much this shift in the Gothic literary movement between the corruption of the church being and the idea of the religious devil and it transforms through the course of these early days of what essentially would become science fiction, but these early Gothics into a fear of like mankind's own hubris and science. And I'm thinking about things like sort of Frankenstein, but also Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This idea that as we advance our thought and our abilities in the scientific sphere, that is also what could possibly harm us. And then the great battle commences between whether it is science that will also save us or whether it is something else. That's something that frankly science fiction has continued to. That is a thing. Our whether our intelligence will be our downfall or not is the great question that sci-fi is almost always asking.
Yeah, but there'll be a few versions which could be our downfall, with our intelligence being only
Yes,
one
yes.
at the moment. Why don't we move on to the heroine's journey and dig into that a little bit from your perspective? Because the first thing that I found fascinating is as a screenwriter, when I was a screenwriter, is going into bookshops and just saying, hero's journey, the absence. I didn't even know there was a heroine's journey. And I think a lot of us have come to it through the absence of that. So I'd love you to speak into what the mystery is and also how you came to it.
Okay, so yeah, back when I was first studying sort of gender and ancient mythology, we studied the hero's journey, and then we immediately also studied the heroine's journey. And
Huh.
I kind of left that sphere and entered the writing sphere, assuming most people had done the same. And that you sort of had them as two companion pieces, that you studied Campbell's thoughts, and then you went on to the Homeric hymns and the Demeter and all that sort of thing. I assume this, the
Yeah.
Elysian journey, etc. And then or Isis and like all of the examples that I actually utilized in the book were ones that we studied as part of this process. And then I went out and I would be talking with my fellow writers, or I would be talking on panels at conventions or conferences, and I would just casually mention and the heroine's journey, which sets up an entirely different model of what it means to win, what it means to be victorious, and what it means to be strong or weak. And some hand or several hands would go up in the audience, and somebody would be like, "Well, what is that, Gail?" And I could be like, "Oh, I can't explain the whole I mean, we have courses on this for a reason." And finally I was like, well, writers just need to know it. Like someone needs to write it out in a way that's relatively easy for writers to understand, and that is not Jungian and isn't trying to give you life advice on your own personal journey. It's basically like, these are the beats of this journey. This is how they have been used in ancient times, as we have a model in the West, at least. And then here are some I chose incredibly highly successful franchises. However I personally feel about them are not as off the table, just commercially successful franchises that clearly utilize this journey for commercial success, and sort of why it appealed, why it's successful, why this is something that we keep writing and we keep reading, whether we like really acknowledge it or not. And yeah, so that was how I came to sort of write the book. I was calling out to the universe for it and nobody else wrote it. And finally I was like, well, I guess my job. I never wanted to write nonfiction, but here we are.
Yeah, yeah. If you can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, go down and light it yourself.
Yes, or as an archaeologist, dig it up, I
Oh,
suppose.
yeah. Um, For the benefit of people who don't really know the beats of the story, and I do love the way you call it beats, is it possible to just go through them briefly?
Sure. So for anybody who cares, if you Google Gail Carriger Heroine's Journey, the book will come up, but also my website will come up. And I actually have a schematic of this on the website, and you can just, it's just right there. You can take a look at it. Because Campbell's is a schematic. And I think, as with Campbell, I think it's helpful to think of it as secular, because if you're not always telling the beat doesn't necessarily map into a single story arc. Sometimes you have heroes that undertake the journey multiple times in their life. In fact, that's more common than not for a hero's journey. I'm thinking about somebody like Heracles who went through 12 of the hero's journey, essentially, right? Um, so that's the first thing. Is to envision it like it's a cycle, and so the heroine's journey is similar. And essentially, what you have is it is a similar kind of pattern to the hero's journey in that the heroine, but it is different in its nuance. So instead of undertaking a quest voluntarily, the heroine is usually involuntary. And generally speaking, she's usually driven to abdicate a certain amount of power, whether that is a place in Mount Olympus or a place in the home or the seat on a throne. And she does that because she has had something taken from her. In ancient times, it's almost always a familial network being broken. So a daughter being stolen in the case of Demeter, or a partner, or a mother, or or a sibling, a sister. And that forces her to leave her power base and go out into the world to search for the thing that has been taken from her. And that's sort of the first major beat. And so but the moment she's left her seat of power, the heroine is in danger. So the more a heroine undertakes her quest and the more solitary and alone she is, because the inciting event is the broken network. So the less network she has, the more at risk and the more in danger the heroine is. So what she immediately starts to do is attempt to rebuild networks. So she will connect up with other members of her own family and get them to help her or ask them to help her. And sometimes they will and sometimes they won't. Usually the presence of the feminine will be helpful. So like sisters, etc. Or brothers who are representing the feminine. And then she will undertake sort of a quest that usually, like with the hero, but it drives her into what amounts to the underworld or a representation of the death experience. She will only survive that experience with the help of other people. And as she builds her network, she rebuilds her family, she finds what was taken from her, or she finds and builds a new found family. She climbs out of that depth of despair, so to speak. And then reunites with what was taken from her, symbolically or in actuality. And the act of that reuniting is usually a compromise. So she will usually negotiate with the person who has taken this other person from her, or with that person herself. So in the case of Demeter, for example, you renegotiate for the seasons of life, and then reclaims her power, re-networked with her lost person, essentially, or people. Sometimes she is entirely removed from her whole culture. And so that's the pattern. It's not dissimilar to like crossing the thresholds, but the ideas of what it means to be successful and what it means to be victorious are entirely different. So for our heroine, to be successful is to be reunited with what was taken, or to rebuild her family unit. And then, while there may be an enemy, there may be big battles, there may be fights, that's less important. And often it's actually undertaken by a different character. So a heroine will send her son or her friend to actually do the fighting for her. Sometimes she will do a bit of it on her own, but the actual defeating of an enemy is much less important to the heroine and therefore to the journey than the reuniting with a network and the reestablishing of some sort of cohesive family unit of support.
It's so stark when you explain it verbally like that, because you really do see the contrast between that and a hero's solitary questing overland journey, whereas she just seems so much more, well, from losing familial or home or part of herself, whatever severs off, it's to form that network and that community is so important. It's kind of like the the whole core of the heroine's journey.
It really is. Yeah. It's the drive, right? The drive for connection is what drives the heroine. The drive for usually violent victory is what drives the hero. The drive for the boon, as Kimball would have put it. Whereas it's a different it's a different goal. The whole, and therefore the stories that we tell built on these two narratives send different messages out into the world about what's important.
Yeah. Um, any other aspects that kind of make it distinct from the hero's journey that would kind of stand out?
I would say the way those connections are handled. So if you think about like hero's journey, and you can think about anything from say I'm thinking of like the Bourne Identity or something like that, right? Sort of a suspense thriller version of the hero's journey to Gilgamesh. There's often strong things of betrayal, and that tends to be because the hero is the most powerful when he's by himself. And so either he or the narrative is always removing his aides. So even if somebody offers him like, makes the passport, the extra identities for him so that they can flee the country or whatever, that person will inevitably be killed. You will know this instinctively as a consumer of these narratives, right? Or they will be a betrayer. So these assistants or assistors in the story, including a love interest, are almost always either are killed or they betray the hero. That's sort of the two paths that they have, and that's very strongly established, particularly by the Greeks. Um, and it's this idea also that what the hero wants is to stay in motion on his quest, and therefore anything that represents status, and often that's civilization, because the hero needs to leave the comfort of civilization and the civilized world, which is often represented by the feminine and marriage and institutions. He must leave them to accomplish his end, to fulfill his quest, whether that is victory or the boon. And so anything that represents that in the context of the story is bound to betray or die away, because the story is constantly isolating him, because he's at his strongest and best when he's isolated, because then he can stay in motion and achieve his end. Whereas the heroine's journey is going to be diametrically opposed to that. So what she is constantly trying to hunt for is this connection of some kind. And so the assisters and which are often sisters, but
That's right.
and the love interests are much less likely, and you have to be, as a storyteller, much more careful in not having them betray your heroine. Because betrayal under the context of a heroine's journey, since the narrative is telling her not just that she should trust, but that she must trust in order to achieve her definition of success, if somebody betrays under that context, it's a lot worse. So you have to be much more careful with the concept of betrayal in a story that is about networking. And those characters, the characters that betray, will often be perceived as the worst possible, the lowest of the low, by the readers and the consumers and the watchers of this particular narrative. So it's much worse to betray in a heroine's journey than it is in a hero's. So I guess that's sort of one thing to think about, is then once you kind of know the patterns of the two, you can see how any archetypes or settings or what have you, these tropes that you drop into the context of either of these, what I would call narrative chassis, they're going to be completely different. Whatever one it will, whether it's evil Eve or human Eve, whether it's the wicked queen or whatever an archetype you pick, is going to behave differently under the context of each. What makes a character evil is going to be different under the context of each.
And I can imagine with that betrayal from the heroine's point of view, because she's networked, means that they're almost like that betrayal doesn't just betray her, but the tribe or her new formed tribe,
Yeah.
her refound family.
And she's losing a part of herself. The identity of the heroine is much more collated to a group identity. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's really difficult, particularly under the context of an individualistic society, and we both come from extremely individualistic societies, that's not negative, that's a positive, that the story and building the group is the element of survival for a heroine.
The other thing that really struck me about the way you described that as well is the motion, the forward motion, which is very much from publishers' point of view or funding bodies, is like, what is your character doing? What is your protagonist going to do?
Yeah.
Whereas it can be very internal, and this
Yeah.
misconception that to have a protagonist having an inward journey or an underworld journey, that's not seen as dramatic or
Yeah.
comedic or whatever.
Yeah, this idea, there's this idea that that plot, like a character's movement through space and time, collates to agency, and that is simplistic, but it also is somewhat dictated by a reliance on and a preference for the hero's journey. That again, like, because the hero must stay in motion, so therefore the hero moving through space and time and choosing to do so is regarded as a good thing by the hero's journey, and in a way by the arbiters of taste as well.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
Whereas it can be extremely boring, a hero's journey that is just moving from point A to point B. It has nothing to do really with engagement. It's how you tell that story. But it also ties to why we see chronic critical disenfranchisement of things like romances or comedies or whatever, where there isn't a lot of what you would call plot in terms of movement from point A to point B, chasing or being chased. But there is a lot of interest and engagement and action and things going on. It just tends to be people talking to each other and people changing and evolving and moving forward in terms of establishing networks and falling in love or building a friendship group.
The romance genre, I know you've spoken a lot about this, and that really does play into what you're saying because it's looked down upon, it's mocked,
Mm,
and yet the audience is always there. And so, what's the problem with
huge.
the powers that hold the purse strings versus the people who are reading, buying, watching, consuming these kind of traditionally female
It's
stories?
truly wild. The last stats I read, which admittedly for, like, 2019, they were, like, pre-pandemic stats, so I would say they've only gone up, said
Yeah.
that romance readers read and buy more romances by, like, 3 or 4-fold than all the other genres combined. Like, talking about commercial genres, so, like, science fiction, fantasy, da 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 da. Like, it's just like, romance readers are there's just way more of them than anything else.
Wow.
And yeah, it's wild, how many people read romance. And, this in part comes from the dawn. I mean, we would have to have a little mini history lesson here, but essentially this comes from sort of the dawn of the printing press and the Victorian era, the rise of industrialization, all of which compounded to allow for a rise of the middle class, the education of women, and women having leisure time for the first time in, somewhat recorded history, at least en masse,
Yeah.
and also being literate. And so women began to both read and write. And generally, what they read and wrote were, the early Gothic romantics, what, was called at the time by the male critics sadly popular. And essentially just what, and the critics were male and or were men in
Uh-huh.
general, and they in general were like, well, we can't have anything to do with this folderol that the ladies are reading. Shocking, shocking. And pretty much it's just gone. It just started like 200, 300 years ago, and we've just kept that up. It's just as a
It's ridiculous.
or just decided, women like it, women read it, women write it, and therefore cannot be good. Ta-da! A value judgment was made. Um, yeah.
And so the women just go and self-publish their own
Yeah,
romance
yeah, it's just it
men
just
do now.
we're like, "Fine. We'll just do it ourselves." Nothing new or different in that
So
regard.
how is that why you started? So you're traditionally published and self-published. Is that why? Was it the frustration of that kind of very patriarchal way of publishing that you went, "I'm gonna do it my own way," or what was your journey?
No, I mean, in publishing's defense, in my case, I was front list. I sold quite well for them, and so I think they would have been happy to continue that relationship, and even though they were mystified in general, to this day, I collect a royalty check from them, and my publisher was like, "We don't understand why we're still cutting these checks for Gail. We don't get it. We bought this book, or we bought this series, and we don't get it." And I'm just like, "Well, that's fine. I get it, but alright." Um But yeah, it's, y in my case, it had more to do with my own personality and preferences of what I wanted to write and how much kind of autonomy I wanted from writing. I really wanted to be able to simply write whatever I wanted to write, and you need to reach fewer people when you're writing self-publishing, to be successful by my personal definition of it, which is to make a living at being a fiction author. I don't have a lot of, super needs, so I'm pretty happy just to earn a decent living writing fiction. Um so, yeah, I was sort of was just like, "Well, I wanna write, sci-fi now, and I wanna write, romance, and I wanna write really sexy stuff because 'cause I'm really scared of writing sex scenes, and I wanna see if I could do that with any aplomb, and that seems like a real challenge." So, stuff like that, and my publisher was like, and I was like, "If there's something that I think you guys would like, I'll pass it along to you, but for now, I'm just gonna do my own thing for a while."
Yeah, amazing. Um, okay, so back to the heroine's journey. You describe Harry Potter as taking a heroine's journey. Could you give me a couple of examples? As because I think people are like, "What?"
Yes, yeah, I was like, "Wow, of course." My favorite thing is I was listening to a podcast, that was talking about Harry Potter and the podcaster said how frustrated they were that, every time Harry was in danger, somebody came to his rescue. And he was like, "And sometimes it's like the ghosts of his parents coming out of his wand, and sometimes it's like, again, the ghost of the parents appearing in the mirror," or whatever it is. And you're like, "Yeah, that's because he's a heroine, right?" Like, if he's alone, he's not gonna be successful. So, Ron and Hermione have to come after him. They have to all undertake the quest together. Like, Ron even when Harry is at his lowest in some of the latter books and movies, it's Ron who comes with the sword to the rescue when he's, nearly drowning in the lake or what have you. So, like, it's a pretty classic heroine's journey, actually, and he seems to follow the art, right? Like, he has family and power to a certain like, literally, the family is taken and his power are both taken away from him. It happens before the book starts, but, like, right? The wizarding world isn't taken away from him. His entire identity is removed from him, and he is the definition of powerless. And he has a network that's trying to help him in their very bad way, right? He has a family network that's, like, well, at least keeping him alive or whatever. And then, his is a journey of connection, finding friends, finding his place, finding his people. And his main motivator almost all along is trying to get his family. Now, his family is dead. He's going to have to build himself a new family. But his entire journey is this, like, learning more about his parents and this world that they inhabited, by extension, learning more about himself. But essentially, his is a full-on journey of networking, of putting together a little team, and he does it pretty quickly, actually. And
Yeah,
then,
it was, and he's in an alternative kind of world, he's reformed a better world, like, which
yeah,
follows that kind of trope.
yeah. But every time he's in peril, like, every time he's given a quest, he can't solve it. The destroying the Horcruxes, for example, he needs everybody to help him. Like, who does the last strike to the last Horcrux? Neville. It's not Harry's job, right? And
Yeah.
that's fine because the heroine's very good at parceling out achievement and, like, sharing the admiration. I mean, a good way if you're thinking visually in terms of screen, for example, a good way is to think about where your power images are. So if you think about something like, the Wonder Woman, the movie, DC Wonder Woman movie with Gal Gadot, that one, all of the posters and all of the images and all of the power shots are her, like, alone with the sword, or her, like, in a crowd, but kind of walking through the crowd, and the crowd is sort of an ominous threat on the outskirts. Those are hero's journey images. Whereas all the Harry Potter power images are him and his friends, him
Yeah.
and a group. Always at the ends of the books and ends of the movies, there's always these group sequences, these like shots of connection. The things that we remember are the things that I remember from the movies, for example, are all this like celebratory gatherings in the around big tables, or or in the dorm all together, these sort of cozy images. And those are the power images. Those are the moment when Harry is at his biggest, at his most strong, when he's with
Mm.
other people. And that
Yeah.
those are sort of easy ways to kind of think about whether you're in a hero or a heroine's journey. And not all stories are going to be one or the other, just so you know, like that there are plenty of other structures and narratives. They don't have to fall into one or the other. But if you're questioning which one you're in, think about how you're being shown power, whether power is in moments of solitary action or power is in moments of connection.
And the kind of reward at the end, something that you
Mm.
just said, all of those images, they're sharing, and you said it earlier, they're sharing the reward. The hero takes it for himself. It is still solo, or herself. They're still solo.
Yeah.
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 So is that something that's very much the heroine sharing all the rewards, reap the rewards together
If
as a
there are
network?
rewards, there doesn't have to be a boon or a recognition in a heroine's journey. It can sometimes be activated pretty elegantly to sort of show, like, and I'm thinking about like the cup at the end of the first Harry Potter book or movie. The way that the house cup is won by Gryffindor, but it is one because each of them are rewarded different points, and it's Neville who sort of stood up to his friends who tips it over and into the brink, and Neville at that juncture is very much a side character. So again, that's a very heroine's journey way to kind of reward, and in a way, from a scripted perspective, it is a way for the writer to be rewarding the viewers who identify more with those other characters than they do with your main character. And this
Yeah.
is where we can get into sort of the sort of commercial success of something like a heroine's journey, has in part to do with the fact that because you are inevitably dealing with a somewhat ensemble cast, you can write multiple characters of different kinds and types and strengths and weaknesses, all of which are balancing each other. And it gives your readers or your audience different people that they can very strongly identify with or want to save or want to rescue. And it doesn't have to just be the hero. It can be lots of other characters. And then, of course, if you want to, you can then spin off and do other movies or other books about those side characters and turn them into main characters. And it works very, very well with the hero's journey. It's a little bit harder to do with the hero's journey, mostly because all
Yes.
your side characters are betrayers or dead.
Um, so this is a broad question, but how can writers write like a heroine then? Whether
Oh,
that's genre or not? Or would it be more helpful, like, if we look at the hidden messages underneath the
I think,
heroines?
I mean, the way I talk about it in the book is I talk about specifically writer's block, because I have a lot of people who come up to me and say that, like, whether accidentally or on purpose, they thought they were writing hero's journey, but they kept hitting up writer's block. And that's because what solves for one journey is exactly the opposite of what solves for another. So with a hero's journey, you want to put your hero in peril and alone as much as possible. So if you're hitting up against writer's block, you remove him from the sequence. You make something explode, you put him into hospital, you throw him out a window, right? Like it's relatively easy. Well, I mean, it's relatively like, okay, we just move something in and
Yeah.
out of the picture with a hero. With a heroine's journey, generally speaking, you as the creator will feel stagnant as you try to isolate her, because she's going to not want to go anywhere or do anything by herself. So what you tend to need to do is throw a new character into the mix, or bring back an old favorite who has information to impart or has a reason for her to need to disguise herself and infiltrate. I always say heroines make very good generals and very good spies. They like those, right? They're information gatherers. And so what they're trying to do is not only put their own network together, but understand how all the other networks around them are operating. And so what they need to move is information. And that can come in the form of a new character or something else. So if you're hitting up against a writer's block in terms of a heroine journey, usually what you need is a new character in the mix. And so that just like simple little toolkit There's a lot of others things that
Yeah,
can be helpful once
cool.
you know one or the other, but that's like just an example.
And I love the way that you say if you feel like you're hitting up the roadblock, it's like, this is a co-creation between the characters and I mean, all writers know that
I
something's
know,
a
I
blessing for
know.
you.
It's so hard to
I don't know. It's so hard to articulate to non-writers, but I'm assuming this is an audience of writers, and so they
yeah.
know.
But part of this is when I was writing the heroine's journey, I was thinking about I'm trying to articulate things that we as writers sort of naturally do. And if you are a natural consumer and if you gravitate naturally towards the heroine's journey already, it's the kind of narrative you enjoy, the kind of new movies you like to watch, then you're probably already utilizing its patterns and its feats without really realizing it.
Mm.
And so sometimes under those circumstances, when you hit up against a writer's block, for example, it's just recognizing where you are in the pattern or that you are indeed on this pattern in this journey that can actually just help you move forward and finish the darn thing.
Yeah, that's immensely helpful. So would it be okay if we look at the terrain of rapid fire and the
Sure,
hidden messages? If you just had the one, like a 1 or 2 word answers, and I think
sure.
you had listed this in your book. So like around the terms of how does a heroine view the following things?
Okay.
Um, so how does a heroine view motivation?
Ooh. So you've stumped me. Um, as uh
Thought
Yeah,
I'd go the hardest way.
how is a heroine motivated, or how does
Yeah,
she view
probably. How is she
motivating
yeah, that's a
others?
good idea. Yeah, how is she motivated?
She's motivated by connection, by the hunt for connecting in whatever form that will take. And it's like yeah. When can Gail give a one-word answer?
Oh,
Essentially,
it's a
look.
hard one. You cannot really give a one-word
Right,
answer.
exactly. A
She's
way
so
to think of this is romance novels. Like, what is the motivation of a romance novel, which is ultimately a heroine's journey? It is finding the other person, finding your match or people if you're writing a polyamorous romance. So, yeah, the motivation is to connect and to
yeah,
build connections. And
clearly, and
in
because she's had that taken from her.
Yeah, and to recognize the strengths in other people and the strengths in herself and the weaknesses of other people and the weaknesses in herself so that those can be balanced.
So she's like a super reader. Like
Mm,
you're not going to serve
yeah.
my purpose.
Yeah. And it's, on a very simplistic level, if you're putting together a quest team with, a rogue and a sorcerer and so on and so forth, you want them all to have sort of different kinds of personalities and different strengths and weaknesses. And a heroine is usually sort of a kind of a mastermind character in that she'll be able to be like, aha, I who, do not have that magical power would be terrible, but my fire witch is my best friend fire witch is perfect to go solve this problem for me.
Actually,
Delegation. Yeah.
that does. It just occurred to me the genre of horror. How does horror? Because often they're in groups, whether they win or lose at the end. But how does horror play into that?
Well, horror, quite frankly, what was it? Somebody once said, I've always thought of it this way, but like horror is just a romance with different background music. It's
True,
Well,
true.
yeah. Or comedy with different background music, right? Like the fine line between surprise can either be used for fear or for humor, right?
Mm.
Yeah. But yeah, so horror is a spin-off of the same thing that birthed all of the other commercial genres, many of which come out of the Gothic literary movement and many of which kind of therefore owe their source material to these journeys. So yeah, horror is but and think about horror in terms of the isolated single character running through the woods, right? We all know what's going to happen to the white nightdress running through the dark woods in a horror novel,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You'll know.
Mm.
So, and that is, of course, right, kind of an expression of the heroine's journey in its way. I don't read horror very widely, so I don't use it as any of the examples in the book, but it's certainly worth talking about. Horror has a lot of other connections to fairy tales as well. So I think it would be a whole other book that would need to be written.
Yeah, definitely, because it's very, very popular at the moment.
It's
There's
very
so much.
popular. Yeah, dark romance and dark horror and horror romance are all like very popular and very acquired. And again, I know that's dovetails to the times in which we are living.
Yes, very much so. Well, given we've got a bit of a time constraint, I thought I'd just talk about how or ask you how you stay true to your own voice. And given the times that we are living in,
Mm.
it's an interesting time in history. So as a creative, as a writer, author, yeah, how do you do that?
It's incredibly hard. I mean, there's a little quote, and I'm sorry, I'm terrible on attributions, but I'm sure you can find it if you type it in. It'll say who said
Yeah.
it. But essentially, the this is precisely the time. Like dark times are precisely the times when artists go to work. But it's also really, really hard. Like I really struggled to write during the pandemic. I'm not one of those authors who busted out a million words while I was in
Yeah.
lockdown. I couldn't do. I was paralyzed for a while, and I'm feeling that way again right now. And there's for me personally, there's not a lot I can do about it except like when I can write and try to give myself as much grace and as much motivation to do so whenever possible. Um, but it's
It's
rough.
paralysis. I think that's a lot of people are very paralyzed, and yet that is almost the medicine. It's like
Mm.
just sitting down at the desk is one of the hardest things, but the
Yeah.
paralysis where we're at the moment.
I
Yeah.
mean, very early on in my career, somebody said, There's no great secret. You just have to put your ass in the chair and put your fingers on the keyboard and press one letter after another." And it frankly still holds true. And some of that paralysis is just like just getting myself to the chair and in front of the computer. And once I do that, I actually will write. So one of my toolkits, and I will say this in case it helps other writers out there, is just to have found a couple of other writers and be like, we're just going to go to a cafe together and we're going to
Mm.
sit across the table from each other and we're going to type. We're not going to talk. We're going to type. And for me, and it's a very heroine thing, isn't it? For me,
Yeah.
that's very helpful. I always joke I'm maybe a little bit of a competitive writer, and it helps just to be like, how many words have you managed? You
Yeah.
know,
No, you
just
don't. Well,
like
you're not going to
yeah,
sit there and stare off into the sunset drinking your tea while everyone's writing in
yeah,
the
yeah,
cafe.
yeah, exactly. If other people are writing, it's really hard not to write. So that is if you can, and if you're struggling to find other people in your area who could co-write with you, the local library and the local independent bookstore, if you still got one, will often know if there's a local writers group. And and somebody to sit and quietly write with. They don't have to write the same genre as you. It's just it's much easier than putting together, say, a critique group or something like that. To just be like, hey, all I want to do is go get an iced coffee and sit in a cafe and write with somebody else for 2 hours or an hour or whatever you can spare, and see if you can put one of those things together. That is the time when I write. The more of those I can organize each week, the more writing I manage to get done right now.
Yeah, I'm a total fan of libraries because you're not going to sit there and, well, you can look at a book if you want, but people who are working in libraries, so it's creating the right atmosphere, like
Yeah.
yoga classes, just sit on the mat.
Yeah.
Just get to the mat. That's the hardest
Just
part.
get there, yeah. That is the hardest part. That really is the hardest part, just to sit down and put your fingers in front of the computer. And
Yes.
the other thing is, there's 2 other things I always say. The first one is give yourself permission to suck. Everybody sucks. Everybody. The first draft sucks for everybody, and guess what? Nobody has to read it. It's okay. The point is how hard it is to just get it done and finish it. So that's the first thing is just give yourself permission to suck. It's fine. Um, yeah. And then what's the other one? No, permission to suck, and then we'll just leave it there.
Yeah, we'll leave it there. That's great. Okay, so regarding the times that we're living in and the story, the power of the story, and how we started our interview with the custodians of narrative. This is what I'm asking every guest. If storytelling carried the power of the heroine's wand, what would it restore, reimagine, or release into the world for you, Gail?
Oh my goodness. What
Current
would it
world, any world.
Ah, um, I am tempted to say compassion. I suspect that is the thing that is most lacking right now.
That's beautiful. And so true. Yeah. Thank you so much for being my guest. It's been absolutely fantastic to talk to you, and I'm truly honoured.
Thank you for having me. And
We got here.
we got here. We connected.
Yeah. We connected.
The Storymakers Rebellion is created on the unceded lands of the Bundjalung Nation in New South Wales, Australia. For tens of thousands of years, storytellers have nurtured a kinder, more connected world. Thank you for listening.